Welcome to episode 4 of Those Two Metal Dudes. Man, we're on a roll. We still have no viewers, but who cares? We're going to talk about a very interesting topic today, and I'm going to let my co-host, Chris, tell you all about it.
Today we're going to discuss Swedish death metal and the importance it had onto the metal scene just in general. So we're just kind of going to go back and forth and just kind of bring up bands and talk about them and talk about their influence upon metal, of modern metal today. We may talk about bands that you may think that, will probably suck or
I know
whatever.
my list is going to, if anybody's watching,
But
we'll definitely...
just like we normally do, it's always picking things that are to the heart. And I have a few on here that I've never heard before that I'm going to bring up that luckily by us doing this, it's fun doing the research because it's like, okay, we're going to pick a topic. I mean, we're not just going to just come in here and just be blindly about what we're doing. But I kind of come up with the topic and I kind of ran it by Mike, and we're both big fans of the Swedish death metal movement, and we'll kind of get into our...
Yes, we are.
Yeah, as you can see, I tried to keep my list within the 90s because I was trying to show the influence. Mike can do whatever because we do this and we do whatever we want, and that's just how we do our show. So I stuck more with the 90s. I don't know what he does.
Mine's a little more modern. Mine's kind of like mid period for the most of the stuff. And then there's some stuff that's like kind of recent within like the last 5 to 10 years. And then there's a couple that are kind of back in the 90s.
But we're just going to talk about albums, bands, just probably if you ask some of these modern bands, these bands would probably be on somebody's list somewhere. That's pretty much. But like doing the Morse sound, I didn't realize in Sweden they had their own little Morse sound within the Sunlight Studios. So when I was going through and doing my research, I kept seeing Sunlight Studios, and I was like, oh, the Swedish Morse sound, eh? Yep. But to me, the Swedes kind of added a little bit more groove to the death metal, don't you think? I mean, they kind of took the Morse sound and then they kind of tweaked it into their own little Swedish ways. But the probably we're going to go back and forth. So I mean, hopefully there'll be something that somebody out there will like and be like, oh yeah, and these guys, yeah, right. But how do you want to go about? You just want to kind of just throw,
start throwing your stuff out. Add a couple of little things like what you just mentioned about their own kind of Morse sound. The Sunlight, they kind of had two. They had Unisound too. That's another one, and I'll probably talk a little bit about that. But so Sunlight and Unisound were kind of two of the main studios that have put out like a bulk of the Swedish extreme stuff. And then about adding the groove to the death metal sound, I think they added a little more melody too. Like they because the Swedish death metal really is kind of like they're the godfathers of what became melodic death metal, in America for the most part. So I feel like they influenced multiple scenes in America. They influenced the melodic death metal scene. They influenced the melodic metalcore stuff that we were talking about, Kill Switch and Shadows Fall and those bands. And then they kind of influenced this other sort of newer wave of metal bands in America that are kind of going back to that throwback sound of like Entombed and those bands that had the buzzsaw guitar, Black Breath and stuff like that. So anyway, but I digress. I'll give it back to Chris and he'll tell you what he knows.
I'm gonna kind of take it back to the beginning, and I kind of went and did research and was scanning the interwebs of looking at other people's lists, and whatnot. But I guess Nihilist, I checked it out, and it was from 1987, and it was actually some of the dudes from Entombed's first band. It sounds. I mean, if you checked it out, it's a Nihilist self-titled. I mean, it sounds literally just like old Left Hand Path, Entombed. Another good one was Carnage, and a great one which I actually texted you when about it was Grave, And I was listening to Into the Grave, and it sounded like what people would call slam nowadays. Because like when I was listening, I just automatically texted him, and I was like, is this is this slam? Like is this the beginnings of of that? Because a lot of times when we do this stuff, we will talk back and forth because I'll be listening to something, and because wow, it all really started was I was listening to In Flames, their Subterranean EP, and I texted Mike, and I was like, dude, put Jesse Leach on vocals, and it's pretty much Killswitch Engage. But a lot of this stuff is just it's just brutal. I mean, we will dive into it. I mainly wanted to hit the late 80s, early 90s really quickly about naming some bands. Dismember was another one.
Great. Pieces EP.
I did I guess I did something wrong. It was like an ever flowing, and then I put ... I'm sorry, y'all, but it didn't allow me to to keep going. But I wasn't familiar with any of these bands, but I'm glad that I did my research and found other things, and it got me now. Now I'm actually fans of of this stuff now. But I'm gonna hold my time, and I'm gonna let Mike kind of jump in, and we're kind of gonna go back and forth about it. So
I had a couple of things like Grave and Dismember. So Grave, I don't know how big of an influence they've had on American bands and everything that we're talking about, because I don't hear them talked about that often.
Right.
But I remember Grave, from way back, and haven't listened to a lot of it, but I do remember the stuff I've heard was really good. It's brutal, And Dismember, I remember having a compilation cassette tape. I don't even remember who put it out or who all was on it, but I remember Dismember was one of the bands on it, and it was a song from their Pieces EP, and to me they remind me a lot of Entombed. Like those two bands sound very similar, especially like with the earlier more death metal Entombed before they changed their sound. But Dismember was, I think, a really underrated, overlooked band in that scene. I don't think they wouldn't be considered like in the big four or whatever, but great band. They had a lot of melody, a lot of melodic guitar solos, but like, those Entombed style vocals and just really brutal old school kind of death metal sound. I think they were kind of like a perfect example of like the mellow death, melodic death metal stuff that you hear people talk about. And I was, after Chris mentioned it the other day, I went back and I started watching videos of some of the Dismember stuff, some of their old stuff, their first album, and man, that was a good band. I need to get some of their stuff. I kind of forgotten about that band until he brought it up. So just a quick run through, probably not a lot to add to what Chris said about Swedish death metal in general, but like we said, a big melodic death metal presence. A lot of the stuff was rooted in hardcore punk, whereas like stuff in America, was more rooted in, other forms of metal, but despite how a lot of these bands sounded, a lot of them had big influences from the hardcore punk scene, which you can kind of hear, especially like, in Entombed and the way they progressed and sounded over the years. They went to like that death and roll kind of thing where it was like kind of like a Motorhead style. But some of the bands just, some of these bands I love and some of them I'm not a big fan of, but, again, like Chris said, is doing our research is kind of like, you still have to kind of pay respect to a lot of these bands that are still pivotal. Just, there's a few of them that I just personally not a big fan of. But, Bathory, Entombed, Dismember, Bloodbath, At the Gates, In Flames, Arch Enemy, Meshuggah, Amon Amarth, Edge of Sanity, Opeth, The Haunted, just to name a few. They influenced melodic metalcore of the 2000s era, Killswitch, Unearth, August Burns Red, Shadows Fall, just to name a few of the bigger ones. They also had a big impact on a lot of modern current bands that we're getting into now, like Black Breath, Gate Creeper. You can definitely hear, I hear a lot of Entombed in Gate Creeper. Parkway Drive, Ginger, even some of these like deathcore type bands. At the Gates was a huge influence on the Black Dahlia murder, especially on Black Dahlia's first album, Unhallowed. And I have a funny story about that. I actually wrote the Black Dahlia Murder off for a long time. We went and saw them in Anniston way before they were the humongously successful band that they are now on Metal Blade for, you know, a long, long time. But I got their first album. I honestly don't really remember much about the show. I kind of remember 3 Inches of Blood, and I hated them. I remembered Himsa vaguely. I like Himsa a lot, but you know, my detailed memories of that show are kind of vague. I was drinking a lot back then, and Black Dahlia Murder, I you know, kind of just vaguely remember that they were good, you know, but I don't remember much after that. So, anyways, I got their first album on Metal Blade, Unhallowed, and I remember I had this other DVD from Metal Blade that had videos, and it had a video from that album, Black Dahlia Murder, Funeral Thirst. That's kind of like their first big hit, if you can call it a hit, in the melodic death metal scene. And I remember listening to a Earache Records sampler CD that I had from years back that had At the Gates, Blinded by Fear from Slaughter of the Soul. And I listened to these 2 songs and I went, man, wait a minute. This sounds exactly the same. I mean, almost like a ripoff. No offense, Black Dahlia, because I've since gone back and I like Black Dahlia Murder a lot now, and I have some more of their albums, and I like the progression and growth that they've done as a band. They're a great band, but I feel like that influence was a little bit too prevalent on that first album, and because of that, I didn't even listen to that album for a long time because I thought, hey man, they just ripped off At the Gates, and I took offense to that. But yeah, so you know, you can definitely hear the vocal influence too in Trevor from Black Dahlia with his higher pitched stuff. What's his name? The singer for At the Gates, Thomas.
Yes.
Thomas Lindbergh. The shrill, higher pitch kind of stuff, man. Like those 2 guys, you know, you could switch them out of bands and you probably wouldn't tell the difference. Good stuff. And then there's the Gothenburg sound, which is, you know, kind of like the Entombed, you know, buzzsaw guitars, the D beat, the punk drum beat, you know, that comes from that hardcore punk. But they threw in these kind of black metal style vocals, you know. So there was like some Norwegian and, you know, and then of course the Norwegian stuff and the Swedish stuff, they kind of intertwine like with the death metal and black metal. There's so much, you know, crossing of paths and bands influencing each other, and they're so close together. But anyway, so that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. You know, yes, Swedish death metal, big influence on so many bands and so many styles of music and a lot of American metal. So I'll just talk about this first album and then pass it back to Chris. Entombed, Crawl, EP, cassette tape. It's the first thing I ever got, 1991, Earache Records. This is a very overlooked, underrated masterpiece, in my opinion. Actually, one of the best things Entombed's ever put out. I think it's one of my favorites for the sentimental reason, but also because, man, when you listen, it's only 3 songs, but if you listen to this, you'll go, holy crap, man, why have I not listened to this? Because it's not really something that most people talk about. They talk about Left Hand Path, Clandestine, you know, Wolverine Blues, and then a lot of people forget about everything after Wolverine Blues because they totally changed. But this is really good, and the biggest thing that stands out is the fact that LG Petrov was not on this album. They had a different singer. So anyway, like we said earlier, Entombed, I see a big influence on bands like Gatecreeper, Turbid North even, Black Breath, and a lot of other bands. They started in 1987, the Crawl EP, 1991, Earache Records, Sunlight Studios, Entombed from Stockholm. LG Petrov wasn't on this album or this EP because him and Nick Anderson had a disagreement. So Orvar Sofstrom was the vocalist for this EP. He was a member of death metal band Nirvana 2002. I remember getting this cassette tape at Camelot Music. That's how long ago that was, because those don't even exist anymore and haven't for a long time. It's got a dark, very dirty, gritty production. The buzzsaw guitar signature sound is there. I mean, as soon as you hear that guitar riff and the drums kick in, you know it's Entombed, no matter who's singing. But speaking of the vocals, I think the singer that was on this was a fantastic vocalist, as good or better. They could have kept him, and I mean, it's really a really good EP. It's very brutal. I got this in high school. Good memories. If you've never checked this out, Entombed Crawl EP, great stuff. Back to you, Chris.
I'm gonna go with it's probably one of the first things that I probably heard from this band. It was I'm gonna go with In Flames' Jester Race, which I mean you really can't go wrong with '90s In Flames at all. I mean you go all the way up to Clayman and just which I mean Reroute to Remain. It's a hard transition, but because we will go into our Metallica debate and we will bring up some stuff that we like that a lot of people don't like, which I like the Reroute to Remain album by In Flames, even though it is different. But it seemed like they had gotten influenced by like Deftones and things like that, and I had no problem with that. I mean, I don't really blame them, and it's just I don't know. I just always dug the thrashiness of their death metal. I guess if that makes any sense to anybody out there, but it's I love the musicianship, vocals. Luckily later on he transitioned to doing dual, but his deep the original because Jester Race, Horacle, even that Subterranean EP. I mean, like it's all just brutal stuff. Which when I was doing research, I noticed that a lot of people were snubbing the Gothenburg scene, which was very strange to me because that's how I got into it, from all of that. And we will mention more bands from that, but I just kind of wanted to throw In Flames because that's what I was really listening to at the time when I wanted to do this topic. But it's just even because the latest that I go is '98, and I did the Haunted self-titled, which I didn't. Going back again, never really paid much attention to it. I love the Haunted, like the Haunted made me do it. That's kind of what I got into. But the self-titled though, I was like, Peter Dolving. I was like, wow, he's a bad man, But definitely the the In Flames from the '90s. That's what I'll stop with, and I'll give my time.
We'll go to two here. The first one, Opeth, Deliverance, masterpiece.
Yes.
Some people would swear by this one as like the oracle of Opeth, and others would be like, no, it's Morning Star, Parkway.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's other albums, but for me, I mean, this is just about as good as it gets. I mean, it's got everything that you want out of Opeth. It's got the guttural death metal vocals. It's got some clean singing. It's got some melody, the amazing guitar playing that Michael Ackerfeld is known for, as well as his awesome vocals. There's only 6 songs on here. The songs are crazy long. There's a 2-minute song. Everything else is over 10 minutes. 11, 13, 10, 10, and 13. I mean, long, just, epic freaking metal. I mean, if you like epic metal that's, lasts 10 to 12 minutes in length with superb musicianship, I mean, look no further. Opeth came out in 1989, and they're from Stockholm, just like Entombed. Michael Ackerfeld, the front man, the genius, the man that has remained. This came out in 2002. It's their 6th full-length album. So, again, there's other albums prior to it that people will say is way better than Deliverance, but, and they might be right. But this, for me, is it's just a masterpiece, long songs, man, So on to the next. This one is a little bit of a from the underground grab bag. This is a band that not necessarily Swedish death metal. They're more categorized as black and thrash, but I think they could fit into the thrash metal category. They have elements of death metal, black metal, I mean, whatever. Witchery, which features a guy from The Haunted. This band came out in 1997. Patrick Jensen is basically the mastermind behind this band that has kept it going still to this day. He was in The Haunted, Seance. Most of the guys in Witchery originally that were in the band when it started came from a band called Satanic Slaughter, which is another kind of like underground cult band in Sweden. This guy was also in Brujeria briefly. Charlie D'Angelo is on this. He was in Arch Enemy. This album, Symphony for the Devil, came out in 2001 on Necropolis Records. If anybody remembers getting Pit Magazine back in the day, they used to have CD samplers from Necropolis, which is how I found out about this band and why I ended up buying this album, because they had a song from this album on the sampler of one of the magazines that I had gotten, and I liked it a lot because it was very thrashy, but it kind of had those sort of black metal style vocals. So there's elements of like melodic death metal on here, but ultimately they're black and thrash. But still, the fact that Patrick Jensen, the Haunted Seance, Satanic Slaughter, all this stuff, and then you got Charlie from Arch Enemy, there's still like maybe not like a huge pivotal influence on a lot of bands, but there's some thrash bands in America. I guarantee you mention Witchery, they would give you the horns up. It's just a great album. The guitar work on here is amazing. I mean, you like really, really good, blistering guitar solos. This has it. And Patrick Jensen's he's an influential kind of a pioneer. He's been around the Swedish metal scene for forever. So that's my grab bag. Hey, what Witchery? Why are they on here? There you go. Back to you.
Just because. I think an important album, I guess, within all this would be Meshuggah's Destroy, Erase, Improve. I vividly remember getting it and hearing Future Breed Machine and just was completely thrown away by I'd never heard time signatures, I guess, that way. Just the riffing, the whole thing. I actually have it out in the truck. That's all I've been listening to going to work and whatnot. But I noticed that you had Chaos Sphere in your thing, and but really, 90s Meshuggah, because a lot of it's just 90s stuff. It seems like a lot of it, because all this that we've been diving into, is a lot of just like it's either from 1990 to 95. There was a big pivotal happening within death metal. Swedes doing their death metal, us doing our American death metal, but it's like, and another one that I like that I listened to that I haven't really listened to, but I sent it to Mike and he didn't really like it, but it was Hypocrisy, and it was the Abducted album. I'd actually seen them in Birmingham when Spinecast had opened up for them, and I seen a young Killswitch Engage as well on that tour.
Lance telling me about
it. They were good. I even dug the album. I never heard it before. Checked it out, and I really don't know if it's pivotal. It was just something that I heard that I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool to me anyway. But definitely Meshuggah. But I'll give it back soon.
I'll say this, a disclaimer about Hypocrisy. I've tried multiple times over the years, listened to snippets of various albums, and it just hasn't grabbed me. But
I'm like that with Voivod.
Great respect for Peter Tägtgren. I like some stuff he's done with other projects like Bloodbath, among one of them I know, and I respect his body of work as a producer and a recording engineer. And I give full credit, like the fact that Peter Tägtgren is a fantastic musician. I don't know, just something about Hypocrisy that just hasn't grabbed me. I'm going to keep trying, though. I'm not going to give up. I might finally find an album that I like. Let's see, I'm going to grab 3 real quick since we're almost out of time for our first half of the episode. Thank you, technology and YouTube and all that. All right, so, and again, my CDs that I pulled out today are definitely not like what most people would grab when they talk about Swedish death metal. I'm just kind of grabbing a lot of stuff out of left field, but it's stuff that I have, that I've listened to a lot, and kind of, I like to hold on to things. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is Amon Amarth. And it's a band I really didn't think about when this topic was first brought up, because I forget a lot of times that they're from Sweden, because I just like, oh, these guys are Vikings, they're from Viking land, And so I was like, when I was doing my research, I was like, holy crap, yeah, Amon Amarth, yeah, definitely. Okay, so Deceiver of the Gods, this one's like a much more modern, 2013 on Metal Blade. Father of the Wolf is like one of the most epic Viking metal tracks of all time. That chorus just makes you want to put on, Viking gear and go into battle. This band formed in 1992. They're pretty much considered like a melodic death metal band. And I've seen, podcasts, Lockhorns and other places that have these arguments about where Amon Amarth belongs, and some people say they don't belong in such and such genre, but whatever. They belong in the death metal category for sure. They're a big influential band, I think, on American bands as well as bands in other countries, in that Viking war metal, mythological metal, whatever
Norse
categories,
mythology.
yeah. I mean, they're kind of like, they're pretty much the kings of this kind of stuff. So I don't really know what else to say, but Amon Amarth, man, they make you want to get on a ship and
drink
hang out with Thor and kill people,
Right.
So that's about all I gotta say, man. Amon Amarth, great stuff.
I guess I'll go back to another a shocker that I listened to, and I was talking to Mike about it before, though, was Dark Tranquillity, and the album was called The Gallery. And I've only known Dark Tranquillity to be like more of a, I hate to put it, more like a gothic, maybe like a Paradise Lost or something of that, where and then I checked it out and I was like, oh wow, this is pretty cool. It's very, I never thought, but like we were talking also, all these bands that we're mentioning have changed. I mean, like Opeth does not sound like Opeth from from back when, like Deliverance or any of that now. In Flames sound nothing like what In Flames sound. We were just mainly just trying to hit what we thought would be the Swedish death metal, what Swedish death metal is to us. So, but I think probably the pivotal album to me that I put it on top of my list was Opeth's My Arms, Your Hearse. I never heard it before, checked it out, almost wept a tear from just how beautifully brutal it was. I thought vocally it kind of was the emergence of what metal is today by doing the growly deep and then going into the singing. And I was like, oh, this is where the beginnings of it. It's where bands were like, it'd be like us, and that album would have came out, and I think it came out in 90, it might have been 98, no, or 96. But either way, when you hear it, you're just automatically just blown away by it. It's just like when Mike's talking about Deliverance. It's just like, they're so epically beautiful, and then turn around and then punch you in the face, brutal, abrasive. But to me, it was just from start to finish, and I was like, if I have to mention this when we do this about, even if you're going, well, they're not Swedish death metal. Put on Deliverance, put on My Arms, Your Hearse, and and then come back and talk to us, because I mean, they are, to me, it's top of the list. That and At the Gates. It's like Mike, the way you were talking about earlier about it influencing Black Dahlia Murder, but At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, though, is just, I thought, just what Swedish death metal, the banner, they would have, they've been carrying that, vocally, musically, it just has everything. I don't really know what else to say. If you don't know what we're talking about, please check out some of these bands. Go and do your homework and check. I mean, because this is brutal stuff. So I really don't know what else.
Vocally, there's a couple of things to add. Like, that's a very good point. It's something I kind of didn't think about much, but the Opeth vocal transitions from like death growls and even the screaming stuff to clean singing. Really, prior to Opeth, there's not a lot of bands in metal that were doing that, because most bands in metal were either singing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You got your Dios and your Iron Maidens and Judas Priests and Metallicas, and most of your thrash bands were, even though some of it maybe not clean singing, but it wasn't really like growling or scream. yelling, shouting, but you pretty much had bands that had the cleaner, more legible style vocals, and then the bands that were not doing that kind of vocal style, that was, the screaming, the harsh stuff, was death metal bands, and like extreme hardcore and stuff like that. So I think, Opeth was a huge influence on that, bringing like metalcore and even new metal, because then it became almost a trend for several years where you turn on, back when there was music videos, or wherever you stream music or listen to stuff on the internet, and every metal band coming out would have this heavy stuff with screaming, and then they'd have a melodic chorus where they would sing. Every singer was doing this, and some of them did it well, and some of them weren't very good at it. But it almost got to the point where I got tired of hearing bands like that, because
definitely.
they all sounded the same. Let's go from super extreme stuff to clean singing, and that's definitely something that came from Opeth and some of those other bands. And then the At the Gates influence vocally, Thomas Lindberg, and then I think the singer for Carcass were probably two of the biggest vocal influences in modern American metal. You look at bands like Zayo and Black Dahlia Murder, and and then list another 100 bands behind them that were
Darkest Hour, all that,
tagging along. Darkest Hour, all those bands, that doing the screaming, but in a higher register. It wasn't quite black metal, but it wasn't death metal. It was sort of in between. It was like this higher register stuff, but it was very powerful. And At the Gates and Carcass, man, right there. I mean, Carcass is not from Sweden, but At the Gates, Thomas Lindberg, his vocal style was huge influence on tons of bands, modern bands and bands in the 2000s. So we're gonna stop this, and we'll be back, and we'll do part 2.